Okay, welcome back after the reconforting coffee and other nice things we had. So now we're going to talk about France and the UK. We'll start with André. André Fazi is a lecturer in political science at the Universitat de Còrsega Pasquale Paoli and member of the Équipe Méditerranéenne de Recherche Juridique. And his research has focused mainly on state-region relations in Europe, putting an emphasis on Corsican and European Mediterranean politics, multi-level politics, and the issue of insularity. He has many publications that have dealt with the politics of accommodation in multinational democracies, putting the Corsican case at the center of it. So it would be very interesting to see how we conceive example of unitary and centralized country. I mean, the most centralized country in the world, maybe, in our imaginary, and talk about the accommodation of Corsica and all that.
Please, thank you, Mireia. Thank you, Xavier, for your invitation in this awesome city, awesome place. Thank you, everybody, for your presence. Thank you, my very distinguished colleagues. I'm very honored to participate to this conference with you. So the French constitutional order is much more complex than we could believe. France has long been portrayed as a symbol of the unitary state. The 1789 revolution sacralized equality of citizens, which involved institutional and normative uniformity. A few days later, Napoleon I established the full subordinations of local structures and very strict hierarchy between the levels of power. And however, France has evolved a lot. When we consider its overseas territories, it looks like a real institutional archipelago. And the most famous case is evidently New Caledonia, with its territorial citizenship, its wide legislative powers that allow the protection of local jobs and the recognition of its right to self-determination. In contrast, in mainland France, the decentralization process initiated in 1982 provided some institutional flexibility, especially in Corsica, but it has not challenged the monopoly of legislative power of the parliament. In some, since the 1960s, we'll try to show this, France has been implementing a dual territorial system with a unitary constitution for mainland and an astonishing a la carte constitution for its overseas. The latter one is obviously a consequence of the decolonization process initiated after World War II, but it has demonstrated a strong adaptability of the state. Thus, France has undergone an impressive shift. According to the revolutionary conception, institutional uniformity was both the consequence and the means of citizen equality. And since the beginnings of the decolonization process, the debate is very different. The 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Men and Citizens still states the law must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. However, since 1979, the jurisprudence of the Constitutional Council takes into account differences in situation. Since 1996, the standard formula is the principle of equality does not preclude the legislator from regulating different situations in different ways. And in fact, the European Court of Justice already said this in 1963. An appearance of discrimination in form may therefore correspond in fact to an absence of discrimination in substance. Thus, we can say now substantial equality in France is more important than formal equality. This is a positive point for asymmetrical developments and particular institutions. However, formal equality has not disappeared. Judges are free to assess the proportionality of the derogation, and like the French elites in general, they remain loyal to unitary values. Moreover, they give very few reasons for their decisions. This is a strong point of criticism in France, compared with the Italian or Spanish constitutional courts, the difference in rulings is quite incredible. Okay, in the first time, I need to address the powerful historical roots of French unitary values. The very foundation of the French Revolution was to replace the society of unequal orders of the ancient regime, the old regime, by a community of citizens with equal rights, the nation, that sizes the sovereign power. And the first consequence was hierarchy, which is the essential feature of unitary systems, according to Daniel Elazar. Sieyès, the main political theorist of the French Revolution, wrote, "One society can only have one general interest. No other would be possible if several opposing interests were supposed to be realized." Therefore, this general interest can only be defined and expressed at the national level by the representatives of the whole nation. And particular interests, in theory, do not have to be considered. They cannot allow the expression of general interests since they oppose it or dismantle it. In this way, local authorities were elected but had no legal personality and were fully integrated into the general administrative organization. According to the first French Constitution, Constitution of 1791, administrators have no representational character. They are agents elected in time by the people to carry out, under supervision and authority of the king, administrative functions. And in 1793-94, when the first French Republic was established, federalism was even a crime punished by death, as it could only divide and therefore destroy the nation. The second consequence of citizen equality in the revolutionary conception was institutional uniformity. According to this order of January 8, 1790, the state is a whole. The departments, the administrative structures, are only sections of the same whole. A unified administration must therefore embrace them all under a common regime. And note that the Committee for the Constitution wanted to go even further, calling for territorial divide that would be as geometric as possible. It was especially Mirabeau who, when addressing the National Assembly, emphasized that history, geography, and demography could not be ignored. But anyway, the key point is that unitarism is not just a system of domination. It is also an ideology. Since its great revolution, France symbolizes the unitary system of government. However, I said earlier, the French state has evolved. On one hand, local authorities acquired legal personality, and the Constitution of the Fourth Republic recognized their fundamental right to self-administration in 1946. Since 1982, France experienced a multi-step decentralization process involving the devolution of numerous administrative competencies and some flexibilization of local organization. Even for Paris, the capital had a special organization since 1794. Now, metropolitan France has many more special provisions and statuses in Paris, in Còrsega, Alsace, in Lyon, etc. And President Macron has even wanted to constitutionalize a right to differentiation, meaning that the law could no longer be the same across metropolitan territories. On the other hand, legislative unity only related to metropolitan territories and citizens. Colonial possessions always had a special status, synonymous with massive exceptions. People from colonized territories were not French citizens. At best, they had very few political rights. At worst, they were slaves. And that being said, imposing the same institutions on these territories would have made no sense. However, the dissolution of the empire after World War II required the construction of new links with all the involved territories. Overseas political elites have chosen different paths, and some sought to get as close as possible to metropolitan standards. But in general, since the 1980s, the increasing diversity of statuses and the development of more advanced forms of autonomy is obvious. Today, each of the 12 French overseas entities has its own status. And since 2003, Article 74 of the Constitution characterizes territories that officially enjoy autonomy, which can translate into very broad powers in legislative matters, even enabling them to favor local populations with respect to other French citizens. In sum, as I said earlier, France has developed and is developing a dual territorial system. It has not one, but two very different territorial constitutions. The first is that of the metropolitan territory and is still based on unitary values, unitary principles, which essentially imply similar legislation and institutions. And nowadays, these principles still deal with a wide range of dimensions. Normative one, French people is sovereign, and only the representatives of the nation, the principle, can pass or amend laws. Exceptions do exist for some overseas territories, but they have always deemed inflexible for metropolitan territories. The fiscal dimension, Parliament defines the regime for all taxes. It is Article 34 of the Constitution. Local taxes exist, but the regional authorities cannot create them, and they have virtually no freedom in setting rates. And finally, the cultural dimension, according to the Constitution and the Constitutional Council. French is the language of the Republic, and the Constitutional Council denies any right to express oneself in another language when dealing with the administrations or public services. Look, despite the strength of these unitary values, they have never been fully applied in Còrsega. And in theory, this supports the idea, especially backed by Corsican nationalists, that the island must necessarily have a special status. Nevertheless, I say the key issue is the true extent of this particularism. First, we find a logic of assimilation with territories fairly subject to the standard national legislation or with some minor adjustments decided by the central government. In this case, I'm not talking about symmetries since the eventual differences are not significant. Second, we find a logic of adaptation, where the right to be different is recognized and has relevant effects, but where the legal system remains based on national standards, even when regional institutions have legislative powers. According to me, it is the case in Italy and Spain. In mainland France, the most relevant cases are surely Paris, capital, and Còrsega. Corsican situation has dramatically evolved since the 1960s from the most advanced integration possible to the differentiated regionalization. Since 1982, Còrsega experienced a paradigm shift and 4 institutional evolutions. Nonetheless, it has been truly gradual institutional change. The Corsican Assembly nowadays has no legislative and fiscal powers and therefore no real autonomy. Note that 4 years ago, Corsican nationalists won 68% of the vote at the territorial elections, and yet the French government still totally refuses to grant autonomy on the Italian or Spanish model to the Corsican Assembly. In the overseas, the category of overseas departments was created in 1946 to ensure maximum assimilation, and national laws and regulations had to apply automatically, and their institutional structures were identical to those on mainland departments. However, exceptions established by law have always been allowed, and assimilation have never been complete nor conclusive. This has provoked anger and fostered demand for change. Since the 2003 constitutional revision, where assemblies can act themselves in the field of law at their request and within a framework fully defined by Parliament. And their institutions can be quite diverse. Also, institutional differentiation is significant. On the contrary, this mechanism of legislative authorization has not been effective at all. In other cases, third, we find the logic of exception, where territorial institutions share little or nothing with national standards. However, this does not always imply a very broad autonomy. The state can retain a dominant position in the majority of fields. For example, in Wallis and Futuna, the customary authorities have a lot of influence. However, this is the last French authority where the executive powers lies in the hands of a state representative. In other cases, especially Polynesia and New Caledonia, the state's influence is essentially based on its traditional Hegelian competencies: defense, justice, public order, criminal law, money, etc. So I call it Hegelian state. This concept of autonomy, inscribed in the Constitution since 2003, allows incredible possibilities compared to the mainland regions. So I hope I have shown that France has become some kind of paradigm of institutional diversity. Of course, the question of equality is one of the central issues in discussions of asymmetries. From an ideological and symbolic point of view, this is natural. But on the contrary, in France, we never talk about the relationship between state dominations on local affairs and socio-economic inequality. I think we can say it is not legal pluralism that threatens the equality of citizens and national ties in metropolitan France. It is inequality of conditions and opportunities between the French who live in wealthy, dynamic metropolitan areas and those who live in declining or depressed areas, sometimes mocked or stigmatized. Here we talk a lot about the España vaciada, which is sometimes protesting, is perfectly right to do so. In France, you don't see anything like it. You have the impression that as long as the public authorities provide a minimum standard of living through economic and social assistance, nothing will happen. Yet France has large depressed areas from which human capital is fleeing every day. It's a disgrace. It's a disgrace, where wages are much lower and where the vote for radical right has made giant progress. To conclude, in France, the issue of asymmetries is addressed mainly from a symbolic point of view. The instrumental dimension, which is a capacity to provide better governance and services, is of course mentioned. This is currently the case for Còrsega. Yes, but however, it is rather marginal, and that's a disgrace too. Of course, it's an issue which cannot be separated from that of geography. It is easier to establish exceptional regimes in archipelagos 15,000 kilometers from mainland France. The need for normative unity is not the same, and state intervention limits the risks of inequality. For example, in Polynesia, the state provides substantial funding for education, even though this is a territorial competence. It is not quite logical, but is it wrong? I don't think. I think it's right, very right. And clearly, strong differentiation does not solve everything. New Caledonia's recognition of the Kanak people as the first people and the territorial legislative power have not led to equal conditions. Far from it. Kanaks are still in a worse situation, obviously. But this does not mean that asymmetries are significantly positive or negative to the population in question. There is no clear evidence of this. It is worth noting that among the French overseas territories, the less autonomous seems to be in the worst situation. Now, the three main questions are first, the limits of this à la carte approach in the overseas, in the French overseas. There is a serious lack of clarity and coherence, both from a legal and political point of view. Many people support now, for example, the end of the separation between the Articles 73 and 74 of the French Constitution. Second, the definition of a new frame for New Caledonia after the free self-determination referendums and the very violent protests of 2024. The new Minister for Overseas, Catalan Manuel Valls, has completed the first mission that has been described as very positive. Secession seems now out of the question, but the principle of decolonization and self-determination are alive, and strong new developments in autonomy are a real possibility. And third and finally, the future of the legislative monopoly of parliament in mainland France and especially Còrsega. The current tense and unsure political context would favor stability. However, the government officially backs a constitutional revision for Còrsega, which would allow the Corsican Assembly to act in the field of law in the same way as the overseas departments, at its request and only within a framework freely defined by Parliament. In short, in France, despite strong ideological and political challenges, the question of asymmetries and differentiation is now central in territorial debates. And I cannot see how this is going to change. The question of equality is not absent from these debates, but is generally addressed separately, marginally, as is if experience had already shown that it was pointless to expect a unique truth in these very diverse territories. Thank you.
Thank you, André. So we're passing now to the UK's case, even if Patricia provides some spoilers, ideas. I think still, I mean, it's one of these examples in textbooks that each textbook defines the UK differently, unitary state, devolve, what devolution means, the most asymmetrical country in the world. Well, Paul Anderson is going to provide us some answers about this. Senior lecturer in politics at Liverpool, John Moores, as I've been instructed, University. His research focuses on comparative territorial politics. He's interested in autonomy, secessionism movement, regional political parties. For us at the Institute, he's the source of one of our publications because he's one of the minds behind the 50 Shades of Federalism. So all these papers that we translate into Catalan regularly. And he also is the author of one very interesting comparison between Catalonia and Scotland, territorial politics, and Catalonia and Scotland, nations in flux, that he has recently published. So, Paul, enlighten us.
Thank you very much. Bon dia a tothom. So I'm going to talk today about the most asymmetric example probably when we're talking about decentralized states. The United Kingdom is probably the most asymmetric state in terms of decentralization of powers, and as Patricia mentioned earlier, in terms of also the fact that not all parts of United Kingdom are fully devolved. The interesting thing about the United Kingdom also is, and this is why I've titled the presentation Evolving Asymmetries, is it continues to evolve. And it will continue to evolve forevermore. And part of the reason for this is we have no fixed constitution. So Scotland, for example, becoming an independent country is just as probable as the United Kingdom becoming a fully fledged federation. No one knows where things are going to go, but asymmetry is the common feature of the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is a country, a state of 4 nations. The UK is a multinational state, and that is an uncontroversial statement. So it's not like, for example, debates here in Spain or elsewhere, where recognition of nationhood is contested by some political groups. In the UK, all political groups except the United Kingdom has 4 nations. And that's important because that's where asymmetry begins. So Scotland is a nation, England is a nation, Wales is a nation, as is Northern Ireland. And each of these nations have their own sense of identity. In Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales for sure. And in England, it's a bit more complicated. Most people in England feel British, and they don't know the difference between feeling English and feeling British. So if you ask a person in England, what makes you English? They will say the royal family. Ah, that's British. Oh, democracy. Ah, that's across the world. Law, rules. So there's no... The sense of English identity is also quite asymmetric, where you have, for example, in the north of England, a northern identity that you don't have elsewhere. If you ask a Scottish person, what's the difference between between being Scottish and being British? I could talk to you for 2 hours, 3 hours. So we understand the differences, but not so much in England. But as a multinational state, this recognition of nationhood and symbolic recognition is important. So for example, if you look at the Union flag of the United Kingdom, it's just the Scottish and Northern Irish and English flags merged together. And this is the sort of beginning of the recognition that the UK is multinational and is slightly different. What's interesting is the United Kingdom has come into being as a country through processes of coercion and processes of consent. And as a result of these different processes, asymmetry was formed at the very beginning of the United Kingdom. So if we go all the way back to when parts of the United Kingdom started to join with England, if you're Welsh, you didn't join, then asymmetry begins here. So for example, Wales was annexed by England in the 16th century, and the process behind this was to just bring Wales into England. For England, see Wales, or for Wales, see England. So for example, and even today, the legal system of England and Wales is the same legal system. So Wales was brought into to England to civilize the Welsh people. And in this process, there was no recognition given to Welshness. So Welshness, or Welsh as a language, for example, was to be eradicated. Welshness as an identity was also to be eradicated. A few centuries later, when Scotland voluntarily joined the Union, we start to see a different process. So in 1707, Scotland willingly joins the Union. In some places in Scotland, that's contested, but we accept now mostly that Scotland voluntarily joined the Union. And when Scotland joins the Union of England and Wales, that is, asymmetry begins. Because when Scotland joins the Union, there is no process of Anglicisation in Scotland. The recognition was Scotland was an independent territory, you're joining with England and Wales, but we are not going to create Little England in Scotland. There were some processes, some rebellions, some little fights when people weren't happy so much with the Union at the beginning. But there was no process of saying all Scottish people now have to be English. And there's 4 kind of examples of this that continue today. So when Scotland joins the Union, for example, the Church of Scotland continue to exist. So the Church of Scotland and the Church of England are the sort of same churches, same God, same beliefs. Both of them are presided over by the King. So King Charles III presides over the Church of Scotland. He presides over the Church of England. Below God, I imagine, but presides over them nonetheless. That maintains. The legal system in Scotland is completely different to the legal system in England. If you study law at a university in Scotland, you cannot practice law in England. You must go back to university in England for a year and convert your course and continue to study. The education system in Scotland is different from the education system in England. So when I went to university in Scotland, my degree was 4 years. In England, it's only 3. So these things were very different from the start in 1707 and maintained today. And the same with local government. And what this asymmetry did at the very beginning was continue to create a sense of Scottish distinctiveness. So this has never gone away. And explains today why there's still a very strong sense of Scottishness and Scottish distinctiveness. In Ireland in 1801, a bit more complicated. Ireland also coerced into union, colonized even, we could argue. But there was some element of asymmetry given here. So in Ireland, for example, there were processes of moving English people to Ireland, mostly moving Protestants to take over from Catholics, and a lot of discrimination. But the Irish legal system continued, and that continues today. So today, for example, the United Kingdom has 3 legal systems: England and Wales, Scotland, and now Northern Ireland. So asymmetry has been at the heart of the territorial model in the UK since the very beginning of union. All parts of the territory have joined the union at different times, and in doing so, with the exception of Wales, asymmetry has taken root and been part of the model of territorial management from the very beginning. Devolution, when it was introduced in 1999, is normally where we start in these debates on asymmetry. But actually, if we look at devolution, and Patricia's already alluded to this, it started way before. In 1920, when Ireland seceded from the Union of the United Kingdom, so in 1801, this whole territory that you see here in the picture of left was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And in 1920, the Ireland, so the part you can see here in grey, seceded from the Union. It left the Union after a series of rebellions. But 6 counties of the territory, the part you can see here in purple, they did not leave. Okay, this was a majority Protestant communities, and they stayed with the United Kingdom, and that created the political entity of Northern Ireland. And the United Kingdom government at the time implemented devolution to Northern Ireland in 1920. So the UK has had a devolved territorial model since then. So as Maria says, when people in textbooks say the United Kingdom has always been a unitary state, it has not quite been that way. England is unitary, but the rest of the United Kingdom, not so much. So Northern Ireland has had devolution between 1920 until 1972. Now, it wasn't very good devolution. It discriminated against Catholics. So for example, if Protestants got access to social housing, Catholics did not. So it wasn't very good. And in 1972, when the Civil War in Northern Ireland started, the UK government abolished devolution and implemented direct rule. But even before the creation of the Scottish Parliament or the Welsh Parliament in the 1990s, the UK had a process of administrative devolution. So we had asymmetry, political asymmetry already hit then. You had the Scottish office and the Welsh office created. These were created in the United Kingdom government. And these offices administered most policies to Scotland and Wales. They created the Secretaries of State for Wales, the Secretaries of State for Scotland. These are cabinet figures, so these are, in effect, the UK government's man in Scotland, and the voice of the UK government in Scotland, but also the voice of Scotland in the UK government. So there was administrative devolution for them, and these territorial offices wielded significant power. They administered policies in Scotland on behalf of the UK government. And then you also had legal asymmetry. So as I mentioned earlier, you have different legal systems. In the late 1960s, when homosexuality was decriminalised in England and Wales, it was not decriminalised in Scotland until 1980. So we had asymmetry in law as well across the territory. And then that leads us to 1999, so the sort of critical juncture of devolution and devolved politics, when 3 devolved assemblies were created. The Scottish Parliament, you can see at the top, designed by a Catalan, the Welsh Assembly in the middle, and then the Northern Irish Assembly at the bottom. The Welsh Assembly has now renamed itself the Welsh Parliament. Missing is the English Parliament, as Patricia mentioned earlier. There is no English Parliament. There is no English government. And so we have in the UK 2 types of asymmetry. The most radical type is the fact that we have 4 nations, and only 3 of these nations have autonomy. Now in England it has slightly changed, and I'll get onto this, but there is no English Parliament, there is no English government. The other asymmetry that we have in the UK is that we have 3 devolved territories, each with different powers, responsibilities. There is an element of symmetry in terms of things that are devolved, but not all parliaments have the same powers. And the other important thing to mention is Northern Ireland has a completely different system. Northern Ireland has a forced power sharing system. So they have a consultational system where there must always be coalition government between at least the 2 biggest political parties. So we have quite a lot of asymmetry in terms of devolution. In the beginning, when we look at kind of how policies were devolved, you can see here there's some asymmetry between the devolved powers, those that are D, and the reserved powers, those that are R. So the UK government today maintains powers, for example, over defence, immigration, the constitution, etc., whereas you have other policies that have been devolved to all 3 parts of the territory. So healthcare, for example, education, which is not there, is there at second, has been devolved to all 3 parts of the territory. So what this means today, the UK government administers policies sometimes on behalf of the whole of the United Kingdom, and sometimes on behalf of England only. It doesn't always understand this, and we saw this during the COVID pandemic. Boris Johnson, when he was Prime Minister, addressing the United Kingdom, telling us all to stay at home 5 years ago in a week's time, said, "I am addressing you as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland," and then realised his powers stopped at the borders of England, because he has no power to introduce a lockdown in Scotland or a lockdown in Wales. Now, it was agreed between all the leaders that the lockdown would happen, so immediately when Boris Johnson finished his speech in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, appeared on television saying, "Stay at home." When Boris Johnson opened up after lockdown, he again made his televised speech, and then the governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland said, no, everyone stay at home. This is England only. They're doing it their own way. And the UK government didn't quite understand this. They didn't realise. Boris Johnson was asked in Parliament, "Do you recognise that sometimes you're just the Prime Minister of England?" And he said no, but he is, or he was. Not again, por favor. So we have here kind of a whole asymmetry of devolved things. But as you can see, not everything is devolved equally. So Wales, for example, have no powers over justice and policing, nor any powers over some social security. And social security is a very interesting one, because this is something we typically don't see devolved completely. So this would be things like pensions and things like this. Pensions in the UK are not devolved, but other social security benefits are. Northern Ireland, for example, only gained justice and policing powers in 2010, whereas in Scotland they were given in 1999. So things have evolved over the years and continue to do so. So we do have in the UK quite significant differentiated policies between the different territories. And here are just a few examples of some of the most interesting ones. The top one is tuition fees to study at a university. In England and Wales, you will pay 9,300 and something pounds per year to study at university. In Scotland, you pay nothing. So I did not pay to go to university. The Scottish government paid for me to go to university. If you are Scottish, and if you are a resident in Scotland, and when we were in the European Union, if you were European. But if you are English, no, you have to pay. Because they didn't want to create welfare tourism between the different states. You can see here, for example, the Social Security Scotland office, whatever it's called. They have the power now to create some benefits in some welfare benefits in the territory, or to top up, to give more money on benefits. So across Social Security now, we have quite a different system. If you are on benefits, for example, in Scotland, you will get more money than if you are on benefits, for example, in England. So you have differentiated systems. Prescriptions, again, very interesting. In Scotland and Wales, prescriptions are completely free. They are paid for by the governments. In England, you pay £9–10 per medicine. And then minimum pricing on alcohol, so it's not all good. In Scotland and in Wales, the governments have introduced a minimum price on alcohol. So for example, I don't know, I make this up, but you cannot buy a bottle of wine in Scotland for less than £5 or £10. So I invent those prices. But they have introduced a minimum price on each unit of alcohol. So it's more expensive to drink alcohol in Scotland than it is in England. And these policies are introduced for ideological reasons. It depends on the government of the day that's there. But also to deal with specific issues. So the minimum pricing, for example, in Scotland is justified because there's more of a problem in Scotland with alcohol than there is in elsewhere in the UK. So the kind of phrase that is used is Scottish solutions to Scottish problems. This is what devolution is, and if that leads to asymmetry, well, that's it. But we're dealing with this problem. When it comes to political parties, again, it's very interesting. Tuition fees in Scotland are free to go to university, but in 2003, when they were introduced in England, they were not as expensive in Scotland as they were in England, so they existed in Scotland at the time. Both governments were Labour governments, but followed different policies. So again, it is not here a sense that you have a Labour government in Westminster, in London, and a Labour government in Scotland will follow different policies. The Labour government in England, at the moment, this year, have just increased tuition fees in England. The Labour government in Scotland have committed to keeping it free. So within the same political party, the broad group, we have different policies as well. The interesting thing then about the United Kingdom is it continues to evolve. So the most recent acts of Scotland and Wales, the Scotland Act 2016 and the Scotland Act 2017, gave more powers to Scotland in 2016. The date there is important because those powers were promised to Scottish people in 2014 if they voted against independence. So the UK government, having agreed to the referendum, eventually said, when they started to see people in Scotland were supporting independence, okay, if you vote against independence, we will give the Scottish Parliament more powers. And they did. So from 2016 on, for example, Scotland gained powers over social security, some, not all, and more fiscal autonomy. So in 1999, when the Scottish Parliament was created, the Scottish Parliament only, I'm thinking in Catalan now, how would you say it in English? They only collected 9% of taxes in 1999. From 2016 on, they collect about 29% of taxes. So most money still comes from the UK government through taxation, but Scotland has the power to collect some of its own taxes. And for example, if you live in Scotland, you pay more tax than you do in England. So the Scottish government justify this by saying, yes, but you get free education, you get free healthcare. Young people get to travel for free on public transport. This is all paid for by higher taxation. So you have inequality or differences in terms of these things too. So you have kind of evolving asymmetries where more power has been given away. The one at the bottom is this little thing that happened in 2016 called Brexit, where the United Kingdom, having left the European Union at the end of 2020, the powers from the European Union were being taken back by the British and then devolved to the territories, in theory. In practice, the UK government said, okay, we will take all these powers back and then we will keep them for a while and then we will devolve them. So there have been some powers given to the devolved territories and some remain with the UK government at the moment as they still work it out. The biggest asymmetry here is Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland to date remains in the EU single market. The rest of the UK, Great Britain, does not. So again, we have here other legal and political symmetries across this. And now the most interesting part of the debate is this little country here called England. 85% of the UK population, about 85% of the UK's GDP, no English Parliament, no English government. The day after the Scottish independence referendum, David Cameron made a speech outside Downing Street saying, thank you very much, Scotland. We're very happy that you want to stay with us. But now it's time for the voice of England to be heard. We want to hear what the English want to do. And there is no appetite in England for a devolved parliament or a devolved government. Because when you're the majority, you don't need this. So what the UK government have done in England is create a series of mayors, what we call now metro mayors. And this is where my research is at the moment, so I'm more than happy to talk to you afterwards all about it. But you can see here it's very asymmetrical. So most of England, so the ones in dark green all have a mayor. So the mayors have some powers over transport, over adult skills, over house building, but they have no assembly, they have no parliament, no legislative assembly, and they have no real fiscal powers. Their main job is to implement the policies of the UK government. And so we're calling it English devolution, but it's not quite devolution. But they are making a big deal. Okay, they are implementing policies that are making them visible. And so what we have now across England is about 50% of the population with a mayor and 50% without. So actually what we're now seeing in England is increased debate about territorial inequality, because you have some mayors with powers who are implementing things like making public transport cheaper, and other parts of the territory where public transport continues to increase because they don't have a mayor to fight their corner. So devolution is a process, as kind of Patricia was alluding to in terms of asymmetry and federalism, is the same in the United Kingdom. And that sort of brings us to why we have asymmetry in the UK. And there's three main reasons. The first one is recognition of the historical differences. The asymmetry, the UK has been a union state where the three different parts have joined with England. And as a result of this, asymmetry has been part of the debate always. It's part of the recognition, the compromise that Scotland has joined the union, but we will allow you to maintain some things that are distinctive. You see also, for example, in Northern Ireland, once the island of Ireland is divided, is partitioned, devolution was given to recognise that this is a part of the territory that is not joined to the mainland. The other main reason is it's a strategy of territorial management. This is important in a multinational state. When you have different parts of territories with different identities, asymmetry becomes a tool, an instrument that the government uses in order to recognize these identities. And if you want to be slightly more pessimistic about it, to stop, for example, independence movements or parts of territories wanting more. The other issue where asymmetry has become quite important is it's used as a tool to continue to manage political challenges. So, for example, when the UK government agreed to have the referendum on Scottish independence, they said the question is yes to independence or no. There's no other choice. And then when the opinion polls in favour of Scottish independence started to increase, the UK government said, okay, maybe we'll give you more autonomy if you vote against. So it's also being used as a tool to kind of manage these tensions. And I think the other important reason, and this is the reason why England doesn't have a government and a parliament, because the people don't want it. It's not necessary. In 2004, there was a referendum in the northeast of England to establish a regional assembly, and 72% of the population, 72 to 80%, I can't remember exactly, voted against. And this is a region with a very strong conception of identity. They didn't want it, and they still don't want it. But they want something. So this is where the mayors have come in. But in Scotland, there was very strong support for an assembly, for a parliament, and that's why it was created. And that leads us to the lovely question of what about territorial inequality? And here is where the United Kingdom becomes very interesting. And we have what colleagues, Ailsa Henderson and co, call the devolution paradox, which is that across the whole of the United Kingdom, people quite like devolution. And within Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, they really want their devolved governments to have more powers. But at the same time, they would like all the policies to be the same across the whole of the United Kingdom. So we have this devolution paradox, where voters in the UK are uncomfortable with territorial inequality, but at the same time, they want their devolved parliaments to have more powers to do things differently. What's interesting about this debate, however, is that it only works in the abstract. If you ask voters in a survey, do you think the same policy, for example, on tuition fees, should be the same across the whole of the United Kingdom? Everyone says yes. But when you say, do you know that this doesn't mean that it's the UK government's policy, it could be different policies? No, then I'm not so keen on this. So I think one of the key things here is that while support for the same policies across the UK is high, this does not mean the UK government's policy. And this is often what we see in the debate when political parties are talking about territorial inequalities. It's because they want their policy to be the one that's enacted. So if, for example, when you ask people, okay, which policy do you want? Most people in Scotland will say, well, we want tuition fees to be free. Most people in England say we want tuition fees to continue to be paid for, but maybe not so expensive. So in the abstract, people want policy uniformity, but actually when you start to break it down into policy areas, they're not so keen. They would rather their territories continue to be different. But the most important thing about this debate is that it's not a debate in United Kingdom politics. There is no political mileage in talking about this issue. When Scotland was going through its independence referendum, there was very little debate about privileges or Scotland is so different that we have to do this differently. They try and avoid this debate. With the rise of the far right, that may change. We don't quite know what the far right's policy is yet on territorial politics. They have changed, flip-flopped from time to time. But it's not a huge issue. What is interesting in England is the creation of what Henderson and co call devolution anxiety, which is that people in England don't want devolution necessarily, but they don't want to miss out on what Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have. So they have this anxiety that something good is happening elsewhere, but we don't want a parliament, but we want the same benefits. And so there's a sort of paradox here. I think the other interesting thing to say about the United Kingdom is all four parts of the territory think they are the worst part. So we are what Henderson and co call a union of grievance. If you ask people in England who gets more, or do you get your fair share, you will see that in every country, no one thinks their country gets the fair share. So this is why the debate probably on inequality has not come, because everyone thinks they're worse than everyone else. So people, for example, most people in Scotland think that England gets more, that Scotland gets more. This is not the case. So you have this kind of union of grievance that has developed. So we have this devolution paradox, but it hasn't quite taken off. So quickly, just to finish, the UK remains hugely asymmetrical in terms of devolution, and that England has no parliament, etc., but also in the policy that it continues to evolve across the different parts of the territory. Asymmetry has been around from the beginning, and potentially that's why it's not so controversial in the UK. It's always been there. If it's broke, don't fix it. So it sort of remains there, always in the background. It has led to very different policies across the United Kingdom, and this only becomes controversial when, for example, Scottish politicians who are in the UK Parliament can vote on English-only issues. So in, for example, 2003, when the UK government introduced tuition fees, the Scottish government, Labour government, were kind of decreasing the fees, and in England they were increased. And the vote in Parliament only passed because Scottish MPs voted in favour for it. So you have these sort of problems. And I think the kind of final point is the interesting one, which is that support for symmetry does exist, but actually when you start to break down the nuances of this, voters in the UK don't want symmetry. They want different policies. But in the abstract, they think symmetry would be better, but in practice, asymmetry is working, and so therefore they are fairly happy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we have this now questions and answers, and anybody? Yeah, you start.
Okay, my question is for Mr. André Fazi. My question is, Còrsega is in a process of asking more autonomy or negotiating a different status with mainland France. And my question is, how insularity is used to ask more or a different status? Insularity as isolation, so filling the gap between the island and mainland.
Thank you, Marcello. In fact, it is a decisive question because a lot of French people fear the domino effect. We can say Corsican nationalists won 68% of the vote. Yes, it's a clear difference with Brittany, with Alsace, with Basque Country. But the geographic feature, the insularity feature of Còrsega could, in theory, help the constitutional differentiation, which is now in discussion. Yes, it's obvious, according to me.
Thanks.
Other questions?
Yeah. I have a question for Andrea and also for Paul. I'm wondering about the role of the European Union integration process in France, like for the recognition of more decentralization process, and on the opposite, on the UK, after Brexit. What is the impact of the European integration process on this devolution?
Thank you, Gabriela. There is a significant impact at the level of international cooperation. Initially, France refused to firm the 1980 Convention of the Council of Europe about cooperation, but it signed this 4 years after. 4 years after, I think it has taken a significant part in the dynamic of administrative regionalization and internationalization of French local authorities. With respect to the Corsican case, the European Union has no effect, and I think it has no effect in Spain or in Italy too.
That's a good question. I think the first thing to say, before Brexit, with regards to England, the debate on English devolution came about because of European structural funds, in that the European Union told the UK government, England is too centralised for us to distribute funds in a fair way. So that was also part of the impetus for the English devolution debate. Post-Brexit, it's a bit more complicated for Northern Ireland, for sure, which remains part of the single market, but also for Scotland and Wales. And I don't think it was appreciated at the time how important being a member of the European Union was for the devolved structures, in the sense that all European law was part of devolution. These structures were created when the UK was still a member, and so therefore the UK and the devolved governments were subject to European laws and regulations. And when Brexit happened, the Scottish government, for political reasons, decided that it wanted to go its own way. So it created its own legislation, the Scotland European Union Continuity Act or something, and this was sent to the UK Constitutional Court by the UK government, again for political reasons. But the Scottish government's reasoning is that they want to try and maintain European links with Europe and kind of laws, so that when Scotland becomes independent, it can easily join the Union. But as time goes on, that's going to be much more difficult. So the European Union, if there is to be another Scottish independence referendum, for example, this would be a huge issue, because it's now more difficult for Scotland to join the European Union than it was in 2014. So kind of post-Brexit, it has complications for the independence debate, but also for how devolution functions. For example, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland no longer have access to structural funds. So these funds are now administered by the UK government. So it's the UK government that decides what money goes, whereas before it was between the Scottish government and the European Union. And this has led to what we call in the United Kingdom muscular unionism, which was the UK government under the Conservatives' policy of saying to the devolved governments, no, this is a hierarchy. The UK government is at the top and you do as you're told. So if we don't give you the money, then you don't get the money. This has changed slightly with the Labour government's election last year, but it's the Brexit issue, I think, is still playing out as a political issue. Not so much elsewhere in the UK, but in Scotland it is still a big issue.
For you, André. What's the difference between, I'm talking about one of the tables you presented. One of the columns was strong state and the other was regalian state. What would be the difference between those two?
In the subcategory of the strong state, the French state maintained the dominant position in the majority of fields. We have some tiny islands like Saint-Barthélemy in the Antilles, which have quite large range of legislative powers, but it is a tiny island of 10,000 inhabitants. And so the French state maintained a strong position, dominant position there too. Yeah. And regalian state, we have really two levels of government, I would say.
More questions? I have a question for you, Paul. Glasses first. Okay, I think you have provided a very clear picture of these asymmetries. But first, the asymmetries among the devolved parliaments are getting more, well, they're more symmetrical more and more. So actually, if I understood well, I mean, the policy differences come from ideological reasons. So it's not related to the type of powers they have, right? Or it would be with Northern Ireland. I mean, do they all have the same powers on education? Do they all have the same powers on, I mean, one thing is the policy areas, and the other thing is what they can do with it. So that's the first question. And then about equality in the middle, because maybe I'm wrong, there are like legal scholars here, but in most of this diversity of policy choices in the UK, if our system would allow them, would be contested politically and socially. So well beyond the constitutional structures, I mean here, Xavier, you know more than I do that the equality principle is one of the instruments to reduce the capacity of the autonomous communities parliament to legislate diversely. But also, I mean, from the perspective, social political perspective, if it's possible to legislate diversely in an autonomous community, there would be some kind of debate. I can't imagine that even if it was possible, that the autonomous communities could legislate on having free and university education would not be socially contested. So it is because it's constitutionally articulated, or because the point of reference of your system is, and quoting the Americans, no taxation without representation. So it seems to me that taxes are at the basis of the legitimacy of diversity, while Spain, France, we are completely in the French model, in liberté, égalité, which means sometimes uniformity, and fraternité, that in sometimes means hierarchy, or from a feminist perspective, patriarchy. So that's well, is more
No.
idea, but I wanted to check with you.
So, on the first question, mostly they can all do the same. They have the same, in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, in most devolved areas, they have the same powers. So the different choices are ideological. It's governments saying. So the famous phrase in Scotland that the Scottish National Party has is, hell will freeze over before we charge students to go to university. So this is a political thing. The interesting thing now is education in Scotland has been, or higher education in Scotland has been free for so long that even the pro-union parties have to support it, because Scottish people will not want to pay for education. So you have now different policies. The Scottish Labour Party, free education and free healthcare. The English Labour Party, expensive higher education and expensive healthcare. I mean, yesterday the UK government announced they're abolishing NHS England and taking it under complete control. NHS Scotland will continue the same. So you have sort of the same policy areas in the devolved things and more or less the same powers, but different ideological reasoning. On the equality issue, it's a fascinating case. And in fact, before I came here, I was talking to some academic friends, and I was saying, I'm right that this is not an issue, correct? Because we've never discussed it before. And they say, yeah, we don't. There is no equality principle in the UK. There's no public debate. Now that doesn't mean that some voters say, and you have this, people in England saying, you know, I'm paying for Scottish students to have free education. And there is an argument there, because Scotland benefits from the Barnett consequentials, which are equivalent of fiscal equalisation. But on the other hand, Scotland will say, well, we pay in with oil and gas, and we pay more. And the cost of living crisis, for example, has become an interesting political football now, where the Scottish government are saying higher taxes on gas, well, that doesn't bring benefits for Scotland, it brings benefits for England or things like this. But we don't have, and I think also, like if we compare it, for example, here to the debate in Spain, you know, we have different traditions. For example, in the UK, we don't settle things legally, we settle things politically. So we, only when Brexit happened was the first time that the devolved governments were going to the Supreme Court against the UK government. Before, you know, the independence referendum, the whole thing was decided in a room. There was no, so I think also those parts of it become important, that there's no legal debate where people are bringing cases to say this is inequality. But I think the other thing is that equality does not mean uniformity. And I think that's no taxation without, that's where that people say, to have equality across the United Kingdom, we do not have to have the same policies, and that's what that graph shows you, that every part of the United Kingdom thinks that other parts are better off than them. So there's this idea that if education is free in Scotland, then this is fine because England benefits in other ways or something like this. So I think that's part of the debate in the UK, that people don't think that equality we have to have the same policies for us to have equality, or that's the age-old debate between equality and equity. Where it might change in the future is because some of these policy choices, education, no, but social security benefits, this is new. It's only been in operation for 4 or 5 years. So if, for example, you are on unemployment benefit in Scotland and you are earning, I don't know, £25,000 a year, but someone in England is earning £15,000 a year, then I think that inequality might start becoming an issue. But at the moment, the inequality debate is within England, because you have now, for example, in Liverpool, it's £2 to go on a bus for a one-way ticket. In other parts of England, without a mayor, it's £3. So you have almost now this inequality within England, and that is when it might become an issue, because there's more people in England to raise the issue. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to be this huge political issue. And governments, I think this is the other thing, politicians in England might not like that education is free in Scotland, but they can't do anything about it. That's devolution.
I think one thing is that you like it or don't like it, but the other thing is whether you feel or you sense it is legitimate. So that's the big difference, I think, in many countries. And I don't know whether it's still the case, but I mean, I think it's 2 years ago, maybe 1 year ago, that the Scottish Parliament passed an act on gender self-determination, which was blocked by the UK Parliament on the basis of equality. So maybe the new issues that are not in the devolve, I mean, it's not clearly devolve or undevolved, maybe they can.
Yeah, so there's two things here. On the gender recognition, the UK government blocked the act, and it was sent to the Supreme Court, but they blocked the act talking about equality, but more in the sense that this legislation affects powers that are for the UK Parliament only. So, because of course you can't have a situation where you're legally recognised as a female or a woman in Scotland, and then you cross the border and you're a man. So the UK government said, no, you don't have the power to do this. That was the main premise, because on legal powers you can have a case in the court. And the other side of this is political. The UK government at the time, the Conservative government, were making political mileage out of culture wars. And are continuing to do so, but they thought, okay, here we have an issue. And even yesterday, so Nicola Sturgeon, who was the First Minister of Scotland and resigned, said yesterday that when the Scottish Parliament finishes in 2026, she will step aside. And the whole debate in the Scottish Parliament yesterday from the Conservatives was, what is a woman? What is a man? So because this gives political mileage to the issue. But the equality principle here is more about you don't have the power to do this. And that's where it went. That's why it went to the courts. But it's political also. That's different now. Labour government in the UK they're not looking for fights. They're trying to reset the relations. Whereas the Conservative government, they want a fight to put Scotland in its place, political.
I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist. Sorry about that. I think it's always important to see what kind of equalizing mechanisms there is in a country. In the first talk, there was the issue of balancing autonomy and cohesion. And to have cohesion, unless all the regions of all the territories have the same taxing capacity, in a situation where the tax power is devolved to the regions, there will be very different tax capacities and very different levels of revenue, and so you will need equalizing mechanisms. These equalizing mechanisms could be explicit or implicit. When you devolve power in taxing terms, everything becomes more explicit because it's evident that there are different tax capacities. So when you introduce mechanism for equalization, especially in countries like Spain and all the other countries, where unity was the origin, so when you try to devolve, you show that there are differences, and you show that you need to introduce mechanisms of equalization. Well, these mechanisms, I think, are not critical when you have, say, overseas territories which are small, and obviously you have to put a lot of money there, but there are small territories, and the country can bear that, can accept that. We have that in Spain with Ceuta and Melilla, two small towns. It's a very small example, but we have two towns. They could not survive by themselves, but they need a lot of grants, but because the territories are small, the question is not relevant. Well, when you consider a country with, say, legal asymmetry or formal asymmetry, like Spain, where you have the Basque Country and Navarra, quite asymmetrical, and at the same time with a very asymmetrical equalization, well, here you have a point of instabilization in some way. If these areas are large, because the Basque Country and Navarra are small in relative terms, is not a big problem, is an implicit accepted problem. But when you consider the possibility of Catalonia as a large area, or England as a large area in comparison to Wales, for instance, well then the question is are the equalizing mechanisms enough, are acceptable, are for all the regions in the country, or only for some of them? So here I think, and again, that's not a problem for the classical federal countries, because when they were independent states, each one was bearing its own revenues. But when they joined, they put some things in common, but the rest is different, but they accept that because the origin was even more different. In unitary countries, we need to define what level of cohesion, solidarity, or equalizing mechanisms. And that's what is unstable sometimes from the beginning, including the targets or including the objectives of that. I say that because I think in Spain it's difficult to, I use Spain because it's our example, but when I compare to other countries, sometimes I think, well, I remember when I was in England that Wales was never going to be the first to ask for devolution unless devolution guarantees the level of services. So that means a big grant from Westminster to Wales, because if you leave Wales on its own, Wales will say, well, we resign, we don't take the autonomy, okay? So it's always a different psychology when you are a rich region and a poor region. So I like, because you theorized about all that before, even if you didn't move much about that, what do you think? How explicit is in in UK, the kind of equalization mechanisms or not explicit, and how explicit that even in Belgium, for instance? I found, when I was in Bolzano, I had the impression that Bolzano was like the Basque Country. A lot of money, not much money passed to the rest of the country of regional services, so I thought the best way to live is either San Sebastian or Bolzano.
Well, for Belgium, the specific thing is that it's a bipolar system, which means there are two big communities, and it's a very conflictuous model. It also means that one is richer than the other. So it's always the same that in this equalization mechanism pays for the other. And that is one of the drivers for these Flemish nationalists, that the financial transfers. Now, if we look at the system, we see that the Constitution allows all communities and regions fiscal autonomy, also the municipalities, by the way. But for the Flemish community and the French-speaking community, because they also have jurisdiction in Brussels, well, there are all practical and legal reasons that they cannot apply it. I think they can, but politically it's not done. So they have it legally, but not in practice. The German-speaking community has fiscal autonomy, but doesn't use it. Why? Because of these problems for the Flemish and the French community, they get grants. And so also the German-speaking community. So it doesn't need to raise taxes, and it's much nicer to get the grants and then spend it on your people. You don't have to ask them for money. The system in our place, and you saw that if I measure it, especially the fiscal arrangements was very cohesive. And that is because the communities, they have competences in social and cultural activities, things that provide services. And so they get grants on the basis of needs. The more students you have in the schools, the more money you get. Whereas for the regions, it is more competitive. It is more based on what they do, how they contribute to the economy, that they get money. So it's very specific, but overall it is quite cohesive. And then some autonomy is given, well, quite some autonomy is given to the regions also to raise their own taxes. So yeah, it's quite a mixed, but overall quite cohesive system.
Yes, Bolzano is a very peculiar situation because it is an autonomous province. Trentino Alto Adige, so Trento and Bolzano, they retain all taxes. So it's a peculiar situation, a unique situation. And as you were saying, you can afford this if it's one case, small, relatively small case. The question became complicated when 3 regions in 2018 asked for the same, something similar. So in the agreement, in the 2018 agreements between the regions, these regions and the states, basically they wanted to retain, at least this was the idea of Veneto, to retain the taxes that they collect on the territories. But because these 3 regions represent the most developed area, the richest area of Italy, it's not affordable for the country that if they retain all taxes. So the real problem behind all these discussions on differentiated autonomy was the equalization mechanism. So during the previous attempt, all the discussions were on the equality and equalization mechanism. This is why, because the context, the constitutional context is that formally in the Constitution there is a fiscal autonomy, but it has never been implemented because it was introduced mainly in the 2001 constitutional reform. Then it took like 8 years to approve a law, an implementation law. Then the crisis happens, and the result is that we are still waiting for the real implementation of the fiscal autonomy and the equality equalization funds, because there should be the equalization of funds in order to provide similar conditions all over Italy. In fact, the Constitutional Court in this judgment of November 2024 said it's not possible to wait again, we cannot wait again this implementation of the fiscal autonomy. You cannot realize the most advanced differentiated autonomy without having before this equalization funds and this real fiscal autonomy. So this is the crucial point all over the differentiation regionalism, and now the realization of this fiscal autonomy is one point of, related with the PNRR, with the new funds, the European funds for the recovery. So it's a milestone that has to be reached in the 2027, so maybe it will be achieved. But it's the real point, and now we cannot go further to the differentiation autonomy if we don't solve before this fiscal autonomy and the realization of the equalization fund. And only a few words about what you were saying, that you solve things politically, mainly. Well, on the opposite, in Italy, everything goes to the Constitutional Court, almost everything, because there is no, this is a lack of the system. There is no a second chamber, so we have a system of conferences where political issues and contrasts can be solved, but really it's also a question of tradition, of legal tradition, but everything goes to the Constitutional Court. So we have many case law every year about division of competences, and all systems of regionalism is settled by the Constitutional Court.
Just briefly on the UK, so we don't have a proper fiscal equalization measure, and the reason for this is that most of the money for the devolved governments comes from the block
grants. So every spending review, the UK government, based on the population of the country, gives a block grant. And the devolved governments can spend that money on what they want, which is why it's an ideological issue to say the Scottish government chooses to spend this money on free education, and the UK government chooses to spend this money on something else. So that's where it becomes political. Where it becomes interesting is we have a formula called the Barnett formula, which is when the UK government increases spending on a devolved area in England. So let's say the UK government increases the budget of education in England by 100 million. This formula calculates how much extra money should be given to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So this is what we call the Barnett consequentials. And this is because the UK government are increasing funding in England, and so therefore the fiscal equalisation, if we want to call it that, is that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will be given more money because of this. Where Barnett is controversial, so Barnett is named after a minister called Joe Barnett, who says that it's the worst formula he ever created and it should be abolished because it benefits Scotland. Scotland, and I would never say this in Scotland, Scotland gets more money than per head by population than the rest of the UK. The people who suffer most are people in England. And this I can understand because now I live there. So if we look at pounds, I was just looking at the dates there, at the data. For every pound is spent by the UK government, it benefits people in Scotland by £1.20, and it benefits people in England by 97 pence. So if you live in England, you're more disadvantaged this way. But where Barnett also becomes interesting, so for example, in London, when they had the 2012 Olympics, the Scottish, Welsh and Northern Irish government said, okay, well, you spend all this money on England, we will get hundreds of millions of pounds in consequentials. And the UK government, the Labour UK government, said, no, the Olympics is not for the benefit of England or London, it's for the benefit of the United Kingdom. And so you get no extra money. And this is where it becomes, so in other countries, you would end up in the courts. In the UK, it was just settled, okay, we're not happy, but this is the way it worked. So it doesn't work always, but in Scotland, there's probably, the debate on fiscal autonomy has never been strong because Scotland benefits from being in the union that way. It benefits from being part of the union because it gets more money than other parts of the United Kingdom.
That's the moment of finishing this session. We have learned a lot. We have seen also the whole picture, and the whole picture is tainted by diversity. As in good academic seminars, one gets out with several questions that are not going to be answered here, of course. But one thing sometimes that after hearing to all you, if asymmetry is a way of, it's just another way of demanding recognition. In some sense, looking at the Spanish experience, one could say that asking for an asymmetrical policy is also a way of asking for a particular recognition. And this is also interesting. But at the end of the day, what stays with us is that if diversity is a reality, and if diversity is, for some people, a problem, perhaps asymmetry is the solution, a solution that has many faces, but we have had the chance here to see some of these interesting faces. Thank you very much for